Good morning, friends. Picture a world that feels both smaller and more complicated than ever, where a single phone call can ripple across continents, and a quiet gesture of condolence in one city becomes a political statement in another. That's the rhythm of our moment, and today I want to take you through a few of the stories making that rhythm feel especially loud. I'll keep it personal, reflective, and plain-spoken, like two neighbors leaning on a fence, watching the same horizon and wondering what comes next. Let's start with a theater of power that's been rewriting itself for years, the long, terrible conversation between Ukraine and Russia. In recent days, I've been thinking about what it means when leaders talk peace while also sharpening their positions as if preparing for a longer fight. Imagine two people sitting at the same table, both saying they want resolution, but one quietly stacking the pieces on the board just in case. That's the texture of these moments. There's a human urgency behind the diplomatic language and a president pleading for aid, a rival warning of further moves. Behind those public lines are families, hospitals, supply chains, and the slow erosion of normal life. When envoys from the world's bigger powers converge in a neutral city to talk, it's tempting to expect decisive breakthroughs. And yet more often than not, those meetings are about keeping options open, drawing red lines, and looking for the smallest bridge across the widest divide. So we listen for signs of thaw, but also watch for the subtle ways both sides prepare for a protracted struggle. It's a grim lesson in how fragile hope can be, and how resilient the machinery of conflict is once it's set in motion. Half a world away, on a bright stretch of sand that usually feels like an escape, a different sort of shock arrived, an attack that left a community in mourning. The images of faithful friends gathering, the low, quiet reverence of a funeral, remind us of something essential: how public spaces are also private hearts exposed. Authorities have responded not only with investigations and memorials, but with promises to tighten the rules around hate speech and to take swifter action when inflammatory narratives spread. That conversation about speech is delicate because the line between safeguarding people and policing thought is a tricky one. But when communities are grieving, when fear has been seeded into places that used to be simple joy, you see why societies move to protect vulnerable groups. It's also a reminder of the power and danger of false claims. When incorrect narratives circulate, they can deepen wounds, drag in unrelated nations, and complicate healing. So the work becomes twofold: to comfort the bereaved and to be precise with facts, so blame doesn't travel like wildfire. Back on the global ledger, energy keeps reasserting its role as geopolitics' chief instrument. There are moves to block oil shipments, to tighten sanctions and choke off revenue streams. Think of oil tankers as the physical arteries of a country's power. When those arteries are constricted, politics responds in shockwaves. The endgame is pressure, to make governments recalibrate their behavior, or at least to narrow their room to maneuver. But every act of pressure creates a counter-reaction. International bodies urge calm, diplomats warn of unintended consequences, and people who live far from the decision rooms feel the ripple effects in markets, in prices, and sometimes in shortages. It's an unforgiving reminder that economic tools are also moral tools, and that wielding them responsibly requires a clarity of aim and a readiness for messy side effects. Now imagine a nation preparing for an election under the watch of its own military. When authorities charge hundreds of people with breaching electoral rules right before a ballot, you can't help but ask, what does free choice look like when the ground has been tilted? Elections have always been more than a logistical exercise. They are a compact between citizens and rulers. When that compact is frayed by preemptive charges and tight controls, the idea of consent starts to feel thin. The challenge for any society in such a moment is to protect the essence of political participation, the ability to act without fear, and yet to acknowledge how security narratives often become the pretext for limiting dissent. On a different diplomatic front, there's a quieter, hopeful beat: long-awaited visits and the tending of friendships between nations, a prime. Minister traveling to a country where he hasn't been before is more than photo ops and handshakes. It's about resetting relationships, investing in shared futures, and saying in practice that geography and history can give way to new strategic complements. These trips often plant seeds that blossom years later: infrastructure projects, educational exchanges, economic ties that were only a line in a memo. Diplomacy isn't always fireworks. Often it's the steady work of finding mutual benefit and the sometimes slow, polite labor of trust building. Closer to home for many in Europe, city officials cleared a hazardous squat where dozens of migrants had made a precarious shelter in an abandoned school. The images are stark: people crammed in, possessions in plastic. Bags, a building meant for children's learning, repurposed out of necessity. How societies respond to such human flows tests their capacity for pragmatism and compassion at once. Evictions and clearances may be justified on safety grounds, but they are also episodes in a longer story about migration, opportunity, and the lack of legal pathways. The moral weight of this issue is in the human stories behind the headlines, not just abstract debates about borders.